Difficulty is a concept now synonymous with the advent of video games. What started off as a means of getting the most amount of coins from arcade enjoyers at large eventually evolved into a pillar of what makes modern game design worth deeply examining. Certain game genres even pride themselves on the level of challenge they present the player, offering a level of competition even to communities rallying around purely single-player experiences. Now, when looking at Yakuza / Like a Dragon specifically, this series is in a rather unique spot in terms of its approach to difficulty. Part of it comes from the fact that Yakuza was born from a combination of both beat-em-up philosophies and classic RPG philosophies. Looking at the structure, you're generally encouraged to do New Game Plus runs of a given Yakuza game. So, like in older arcade beat-em-ups, the knowledge attained from a first playthrough would allow for a more seamless experience in the new run. Except now, the playable character would also have something tangible to show from the challenges that were overcome. In this case, having a deeper moveset be accessible from the get-go. However, looking at its RPG influences, Yakuza games also incentivize exploration, leading to the acquisition of experience points, which would eventually lead to a maxed out character, meaning that the act of fully immersing yourself in the game runs the risk of largely removing the need for technical proficiency in your gameplay approach moving forward. Because of this, the idea of discussing difficulty within Yakuza may seem odd for someone with only passing familiarity with the series. However, by nature of the series also having an ever-growing community, Yakuza fans have found numerous ways to challenge themselves beyond what the series may offer on the surface. No upgrade runs, no damage content, and speedruns are just a few examples of experimenting with the basics of this franchise, and each of them requires a different type of skill, resulting in each of these approaches offering a slightly different definition of difficulty. This begs the question, which of the 20 currently released Yakuza games is truly the hardest? Well, much like with my previous debate video on Yakuza's combat systems, there isn't a unanimously agreed upon answer. For a speedrunner, the game of choice in terms of sheer difficulty could be Judgment or Lost Paradise, with the former's legend difficulty any % run requiring exceptional precision thanks to the game's Mortal Wound system. As for Lost Paradise, its excessive focus on grinding means that speed is your biggest enemy the further your run progresses, making it another easy contender. On the other hand, if we're talking about no damage content, an entry like Yakuza 0 or even Yakuza Kiwami could be deemed as the worst, by nature of the sheer amount of gun-wielding enemies present, whose off-screen poke-shots could spell doom for your challenge run in an instant. As for me, my perspective on difficulty is different than either of the aforementioned ones, as my preferred way of playing, as was alluded to in the intro, centers around New Game Plus, so the comparison of challenge instead falls onto the highest difficulty settings being tackled by a maxed out character. And this is where things get interesting. You see, certain games in this franchise either require you to start a legend difficulty run from scratch, or maybe even lack a New Game Plus mode to begin with, meaning that games like Yakuza 0 and Gaiden put the majority of players in an identical starting point while contending with its hardest settings. If you're patient, however, the leveling system in these two games grinds the concept of difficulty into the dust, meaning that neither Zero's Legend run nor Gaiden's Professional run would fall under the franchise's biggest offenders for me. Yakuza Dead Souls, on the other hand, takes the initial challenge proposed by the aforementioned titles and ramps up the frustration by a mile. Not only do you start from scratch, on the titular Dead Souls difficulty, but you also need to contend with enemies in a perpetually aggroed state and increased numbers, along with having to rely on a well-known speedrun exploit to even hit this game's QTEs. They will absolutely be your saving grace in a run, as you'll need to make every single bullet count in Dead Souls difficulty. So, if it wasn't obvious, I would easily put this particular spin-off in the upper echelon of difficulty in the franchise. And while we're on that, Dead Souls even serves as the perfect segue into another relevant point of interest: the unique difficulties. Certain entries in this series have taken it upon themselves to introduce difficulty settings that exceed the traditional X-Hard or Legend difficulty. So alongside Dead Souls, Lost Paradise and Ishin Kiwami have decided to try this approach as well. which is unfortunate given that these two are among the grindiest games in the franchise. In the case of Lost Paradise, the canon difficulty makes it so that all the enemies in the game are scaled in accordance to their strength from the manga series. This might mean that the average enemy encounters you find in Eden could be crushed without worry, but this also means that the many bosses you encounter become a new level of pain to go through. The very first boss of the game immediately jumps up to level 50, whereas someone like Rao, who isn't even the final boss, will be at level 99 during your fight, which means his signature attack turns into a one-hit kill, as does nearly every combo he does, from what I can recall. Then, with regards to Ishin Kiwami, this entry is more of a tedious by the numbers affair in terms of its newly introduced Ishin difficulty. Apparently, the difficulty rebalancing makes it so that, compared to normal difficulty, enemies deal 9 times the damage, heat acquisition is cut down to less than a third of the normal amount, and the healing properties of various items are reduced to a measly 25%. It is essentially the worst example of a war of attrition, meaning that you'll be forced into using the cheapest of card builds, naturally going for the best craftable weapons, and having to contend with the awfully rebalanced upgrade trees compared to OG Ishin if you want to overcome Ishin difficulty. You may be able to get each style in the game to level 99 in theory, but unless you resort to using a cheat engine, it would take you roughly 15 blood moons to grind the necessary orbs out legitimately. So much like Dead Souls, Lost Paradise and Ishin Kiwami also rank pretty high in terms of series difficulty. Having said that, there's obviously one game that I haven't mentioned yet that I would easily rank above them. You knew this was coming. Let's talk about the hidden gem that is Kurohyou 2 and its particular blend of the X-Hard difficulty. A lot can be said about this game, from its unique limb damage system that was essentially a predecessor to Judgment's Mortal Wounds, to the unique camera in combat only allowing focus on a single combatant at a time, to spatial hazards, to NPCs grabbing you mid-combat, etc, etc. Kurohyou 2 can indeed be unforgiving, but arguably the biggest thing elevating it above the other games in the series, in terms of sheer difficulty, is the fact that street encounters don't follow the rules of attacking one at a time. Once you're in, it's basically done to must die time in your city of choice. Enemies can do tag heat actions on you, no one politely waits for you to recover, there's no such thing as camera hacks to lend you a hand, like in DMC5's Hell in Hell mode, and if you thought Leon's video on Yakuza-style enemies from this game was somehow over-exaggerating the problem, trust me, he was right on point about those fights feeling like an eternity. Also, please don't get me started on the secret boss of this game, we'll be here for like 20 extra minutes. Coincidentally, the average runtime of a casual player's attempt against this bloke. So, in conclusion of this specific segment, my personal picks for the hardest Yakuza games would include Kurohyou 2, Dead Souls, Lost Paradise, and Ishin Kiwami, for the reasons that were outlined earlier. If we were to expand the premise of the video onto the overall experience of a game across all difficulties, regardless of whether you're controlling a fully leveled up character or not, you could easily add OG Ishin and Judgment into the mix as well, thanks to the latter's Mortal Wounds system and the former's aggressive AI and blacksmith system. Now, it wouldn't feel right to approach a topic like difficulty in Yakuza without at least passingly addressing every entry in the series, so in the interest of presenting a more conclusive argument, here's a speed round with my own estimates on what the hardest parts of the games are. Yakuza 1 and 2 share a number of similarities with one another, with the main thing elevating the first game's difficulty over the second being the more problematic lock-on. Other than that, if you've grown up with the PlayStation 2 era of action games, you'll find both of these entries to be fairly manageable on higher difficulties, even if your strategy winds up being to dodge behind everyone and execute a full combo. Yakuza 3 is frequently thrown under the difficulty bus thanks to the Blockuza meme, but as I've outlined in an older episode of Hanya's Advocate, it's a game where pure button mashing never results in an efficient fight. Instead, the game pushes you to be more observant and bait out an enemy's moves, meaning that over time, it will broaden your perspective on what difficulty can entail within the confines of a Yakuza game specifically. 3 is definitely above average in terms of series difficulty, but it's nowhere near as hard as people make it out to be. As long as you switch things up, Rather than just spamming the exact same rush combo or nothing but grabs, the game will actually become a lot more manageable. Well, except for Lo Kalong, but that's a different story. Yakuza 4 on 5, on the other hand, are arguably among the easiest games in the franchise. You have characters that control beautifully, with a wide array of moves at their disposal, and arguably the only character that will take some getting used to out of them will be Shinada. But even then, the classic square, triangle, circle combo, or spamming his weapon-based attacks, will essentially get you through every encounter with ease. Yakuza 6 and Kiwami 2 are even easier than 4 and 5, by nature of the early Dragon Engine's messy difficulty balancing. Between the nature of the upgrade tree, the busted equipment stats, and the existence of Muscle Soda, these two games arguably present the most comfortable run through a Legend difficulty setting. Moving on to Yakuza 7 and Infinite Wealth, it's evident that these two are in a category of their own, by nature of a significantly different combat system. But thanks to the enemy levels in New Game Plus being the same, no matter if it's your first run or 71st run of a given difficulty, the answer to any troublesome encounter is to grind and pay attention to elemental weaknesses. By the end, you may actually feel like you're playing a beat-em-up game rather than a turn-based one. As for the remaining spin-offs, Kenzan is tough but fair, feeling like a continuation of the PS2 era's philosophy. So essentially, dash behind an enemy and spam your usual combos. Kurohyou 1 is essentially a more forgiving version of Kurohyou 2, by nature of a lesser level of aggression in street encounters. The game still poses an above-average challenge, but the actual X-Hard run definitely skews towards the fun side of things more than the infuriating side. Lost Judgment, by nature of easily spammable enemy juggling and the removal of mortal wounds, is pretty easy, to the point where the real challenge of its Legend run actually stems from stuff like the insta-fail stealth segments. In fact, I'd argue that those accursed segments are exactly why this game omitted the classic rule of Legend runs, where you'd be booted to the menu upon death. In this game, you can just restart from a checkpoint, which removes the pressure almost entirely. Lastly, one thing I forgot to add about Like a Dragon Gaiden is that juggled enemies hang in the air significantly less if you play on higher difficulty settings. So if you rely on spamming this option like in Lost Judgment, this game will actually force you to change your approach, which is something I greatly appreciate. And I believe that's all of the games covered in some capacity. Keep in mind that this is just my personal experience with the series, so if you had a very specific game cause you trouble on its highest difficulty runs, by all means, share your experiences in the comments. I hope you found this brief video entertaining, and that you'll look forward to whatever comes next. So, until next time, take care of yourselves, and have a great day. Cheers!